be able to provide this afternoon's program. We want to be sure that we say a word of thanks to Commissioner Drennan of the department for his cooperation, Nancy Herhold and the events staff, the technical services staff. Fred Blake and the Capitol High School video staff is going to tape the entire program this afternoon. Our thanks to them, and especially to Fred Armstrong and the staff of the archives section here. The program today would not have happened without the cooperation of the Humanities Council in West Virginia, and I would extend another word of thanks for their support. Finally, ideas like this don't just happen, and Associate Professor of History at Wesleyan, Rob Rupp, really has served as a keystone in seeing that the human resources as well as the intellectual resources have come together for this afternoon's program. So I would like to present him to you in order to kick this off in the most appropriate way, giving you the right kind of background. We hope you find the afternoon pleasant, enjoyable, and enlightening. Rob?
Thank you, President Cordes, for helping back this centennial of West Virginia Wesleyan College, and of course to the department for supporting this as well as humanities. Imagine that when we went to sleep every night, all our memories were erased, and when we woke up in the morning, we didn't know who we were, or what we did, or what we could be. Now, we as a state and we as a nation aren't purposely erasing memories, but we're allowing them to slip away. We forget, or we fail to pass on important events and a sense of history to the next generation. Today is a celebration as well as a reunion. It's a way to remember an important time in West Virginia history when it was at central of national attention. This primary made a difference in the history of this country. It not only propelled Jack Kennedy to the presidency, but it undermined forever the question of the religious question in American politics. We were center stage for that day 30 years ago, and I'm glad we're getting together to recall that event. You know, to remember the past, it's like lighting a candle in a dark room. And I want us today, this afternoon, to light a lot of candles, to have a lot of memories. And I want that bonfire of shared experiences and insights and observations to light up this room and call attention to this state. Now, I think passing on history is very important. And it's not just the history of cartoon fantasies, and it's not the history of MTV videos. It's the history of what they call the stuff of life, the good and the bad, the work and the dreams, and the tribulations and the triumphs. And I think that's what we're here too about. But I'm not going to stop talking here in terms of introductory remarks, because we're going to show a video that Dick Faust here assembled of different film clips to give us a sense of the past on that side. And what I want us to do is to go back to 1960. Go back to the time when UVA had Jerry West and not Major Harris. I want us to go back to Charleston when we had the Hotel Daniel Boone and not 3 Holiday Inns like we have today. I want us to go back when politics had speeches and not sound bites, when campaigns had managers and not TV consultants. I want us to go back those 30 years, and as they said, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then this collage that Dick Faust has assembled is going to be worth 1,000,000. Thank you very much, and welcome to the conference.
No crap. You guys want to sit? Okay, sit here.
I'm Herb Little. I'm a retired Associated Press reporter, and I covered that campaign 30 years ago for the AP. It doesn't seem like 30 years ago. seems like just a short time ago. That campaign attracted more media to West Virginia than any campaign before or since. During the 2 weeks they were all here and had the people on the road all the time. New York Times, Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, the Washington Star, Time, Life, Newsweek, the Chicago papers, the three networks, and more, I'm sure. Those are the ones that come to mind. Of the older reporters who covered that campaign, many are no longer with us. Theodore White, Art Ensign, Bill Lawrence of the New York Times, and some others have long since gone to the great newsroom in the sky. Of those that are still around, most of us have reached the awkward age. That's too old for the sexual revolution, but still too young for euthanasia. One of the...
Speak for yourself.
Bob Miller said, speak for himself. One of our panelists at the time of that campaign was Tom Stafford of the Charleston Gazette. Tom's a native of Grafton. He was managing editor of the Raleigh Register in Becker before he came to Charleston. He was with the Gazette for 12 years, first as political editor and later as associate editor. And then he left the newspaper business to become clerk of the United States District Court for Northern West Virginia, located in Elkins, where he still lives. And he retired in 1984 after 19 years in that clerk position. Tom?
I am going to speak from a lecture that I gave at Wesleyan a couple of months ago on this very subject. I asked Dr. Rupp what I should say, and he said, well, just stick to that, because it is a kind of a generalization about the campaign of 1960. I am here today to talk about West Virginia's one shining moment in the national political spotlight. The leading players are John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, and a secondary performer off stage at the moment, but with a very large shadow appearing from the wings, is Lyndon Johnson. It may seem at first as if this discourse should begin at the time in 1960 when Kennedy and Humphrey squared off against each other in the West Virginia primary. But as told by Theodore White in his book, The Making of the President, 1960, a prelude to this event needs to be addressed. It was at the 1956 Democratic Convention in the smelly old Stockyards Amphitheater on Chicago's South Side that the whole process of nominating presidential candidates was pushed back in time by a half century, and the voters once again gained a measure of control of the electoral machinery. From the early years of the 20th century until this particular convention, national conventions had been boss-controlled, and all the elected delegates did was formally endorse those candidates the bosses had chosen for president and vice president. A politically shrewd and hard-drinking womanizer from Tennessee, Senator Estes Kefauver, and I saw it happen here in Charleston at the Dan Lagoon Hotel, changed the script in 1956 by turning to the primaries as his entryway to power. With a plodding stroll across much of America, he gave renewed meaning to the delegate system, and never again have the conventions been as they had been in the past. I don't mean to say that they were or are anything but an anointing ceremonial for those men or women who become nominees. They are a massive circus played out on TV for all of us to enjoy or growl about, depending on our political persuasion. But the nominees have had to work their way through the primaries and become winners in those primaries before they have had a chance to win nomination at the convention. One needs only to examine how Kennedy found his way to national prominence and how others like Jimmy Carter borrowed from his text to run their grassroots campaigns for the presidency. The outcome of the 1956 convention had been foreordained. The presidential nominee was to be Adlai Stevenson, a former Illinois governor. It was a nomination for vice president that changed things. Moments after his nomination, Stevenson walked to the rostrum and announced that he would not choose a running mate, that the next day's balloting for vice president would be an open contest. At that moment, we had hello and goodbye, hello to the People's Convention of the future, and goodbye to the boss-run extravaganzas of the past. All night long, the vice presidential hopefuls campaigned. I attended a Humphrey rally at 4 a.m. and was awakened at 6 a.m. by an impromptu parade of Kentucky Governor Happy Chandler supporters around the hotel where I was staying. In a wild 2-hour series of ballotings that afternoon, Humphrey faded fast, and it was a fight to the finish between Kefauver and Kennedy, with the delegate trade-offs coming so swiftly that I, as a newsman, couldn't keep up with what was going on in the West Virginia delegation. In time, Kefauver's earlier campaign through the states paid a dividend. He won the nomination, but although Kennedy lost, he had gained recognition and his star had begun its ascendancy into the political heavens. The final phase of the 1956 campaign was a dreary political exercise. With Dwight Eisenhower running against Stevenson for the second time, it was a walkaway. In a calm and protracted examination of this event, future presidential hopefuls came to realize that their only path to the presidency was through the primaries. And along the way, Kennedy and Humphrey chose to campaign in Wisconsin and West Virginia in making their bid for the presidency. Humphrey, who had expected Wisconsin to have built-in advantages for him since it bordered his native Minnesota, lost to Kennedy, and West Virginia was his last best hope for the 1960 nomination. Kennedy had another problem. He was a Catholic, which carried with it the myth that a member of his religious faith was not an acceptable tenant of the White House. Also, having found that Wisconsin did not give him the victory he needed, West Virginia had become the focal point of the campaign. He won in Wisconsin by a comfortable 56% of the vote, yet analysis showed that his victory margin came basically in Catholic districts. Humphrey had carried those that were predominantly Protestant. Kennedy had tried in the past to dodge this test, but across the country, the issue had gained so much attention that for the first time since New York Governor Al Smith ran against Herbert Hoover in 1928, it was a matter of national concern. Kennedy was not unknown at the time of his filing in West Virginia. He had visited the state as a senator with his lovely wife, Jackie, and in 1956, he began setting up his organization with Robert McDonough, a Parkersburg printing plant owner, his point man. Humphrey had also visited West Virginia by this time as a speaker at party gatherings, but he as yet did not have an organization with a person in charge like McDonough, who was experienced in county and precinct organization. Theology and its doctrinaire credos did not surface in early planning in West Virginia. I am reminded of a meeting Gazette editor Harry Hoffman and I had with Ted Sorensen, one of the brightest of Kennedy's bright young men, when he came to Charleston on a fact-finding trip. We talked of many things. His interest was a voter profile, and his questions were more humanist than religious, more attuned to economics than politics. West Virginia was fabulously rich in the basic wealth which separates the rich from the poor: coal, natural gas, oil, timber, water, limestone, glass sand. Unfortunately, it was poor in the ability of its people to translate this wealth into the good things that make life satisfying to them. It was, in other words, one of the states regarded as a poor relation within the Union, and one whose ills could in large part be blamed on the Eisenhower administration. The Kennedys planned to emphasize this condition, but having studied the religious demographics of America, Kennedy's Catholicism was to be addressed. Unknown to most West Virginians, it had fewer people affiliated with organized religious faiths than any other state, and if the subject of Catholicism was to be brought into the political dialogue anywhere, there was no better place to do it than here. The confrontation between Kennedy and Humphrey was a storybook contest. Kennedy, young, handsome, Harvard-educated son of a multimillionaire, had been staff assistant to his ambassador father at the court of St. James. He was a war hero with wounds from his PT boat exploits in the South Pacific, and he had written a bestseller, Profiles in Courage, which won for him the greatest of all journalistic awards, the Pulitzer. Humphrey, a jolly Midwesterner, had grown up in the Depression years as a son of a small-town pharmacist. He had trained in the same profession, winning a Phi Beta Kappa key along the way, and from youth to manhood, his life had been a struggle. At one time in his early years, he worked several jobs simultaneously to pay off a political campaign debt with wife Muriel, pitching in to help meet the expenses of everyday living. Where Kennedy came from a background of money and political power in Massachusetts, his maternal grandfather had been mayor of Boston, Humphrey had to fight his way alone and underfunded through the precincts to the mayorship of Milwaukee, thence with self-developed political skills to the U.S. Senate. Both Kennedy and Humphrey were of liberal Democratic persuasion, with Humphrey leaning more leftward than his opponent. Kennedy and Humphrey moved into West Virginia for the final phase of the primary campaign, with Humphrey clearly in the lead. I'm not going to go into these figures because we had a gentleman here from the Kennedy organization who went into all those figures, and I'll move on a little. Kennedy, his friends, brothers, and sisters campaigned on his war experiences. Humphrey had none. They brought Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. into the state to talk about his father's record in this enclave of New Dealism, and he implied that Humphrey was simply a stalking horse for Senators Stuart Symington or Lyndon Johnson, who likewise were running for president. Still, the religious question remained the preeminent curse of their cause. The shape of the problem made it impossible for Humphrey, the most tolerant of men, to campaign on this point, and gradually it began to turn the tide. I refuse, Kennedy said time and again, to believe that I was denied the right to be president on the day I was baptized. The voters listened. 2 weeks before the election, the Humphrey margin had dropped to 55-45, and on Saturday before Election Day, a Harris sampling showed a 45-42 edge for Humphrey. This was a sad day for him. Leaving Charleston early in a drizzling rain on an upstate bus tour through Clay, Gassaway, Sutton, Weston, and Clarksburg, he and his staff discovered by the time they reached Sutton that Kennedy money was being spread around everywhere. On the courthouse lawn, I asked a troubled Humphrey aide what was bothering him. They're buying the election, he replied. Not only, as later investigation bore out, were the Kennedys spending heavily on precinct organization, they were buying votes, as I learned, in Charleston's poor neighborhoods. Gazette publisher Ned Chilton had the same thing told him by Neil Pierce he told Neil Pierce for his book, The Border States South. Altogether, the Kennedys spent $250,000 during the West Virginia primary to Humphrey's $30,000. As this campaign indicated so dramatically, money was the deciding factor. Although at the time voters started going to the polls to cast their ballots, Kennedy had given up and flown back to Washington. Humphrey was evidently better keyed to reality. In a brief interview with him the day before the election, I got the distinct impression that he knew he had lost. When, by 10 p.m. on election night, returns from across the state showed a Kennedy sweep, calls went out for him to return to Charleston. He hurriedly pulled himself together and with his wife came back for a grand celebration at his headquarters. When asked what he planned to do the next day, he said, I have to study up on the problems of Maryland. I'm going to campaign there tomorrow. Humphrey's post-election comment was, I am no longer a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. At the Democratic National Convention several weeks later, an event highlighted by the arrival of Kennedy in American Airlines plane bearing the words on its side, "Flagship West Virginia," he was nominated on the first ballot. Afterwards, Associated Press writer Arthur Edson wrote, "If our political disputes are ever remembered as our battlefields are now, West Virginia will become a national shrine. For it was in West Virginia's beautiful mountains, its thriving cities, in its impoverished coal fields that the decisive battle was fought that gave John F. Kennedy the Democratic presidential nomination." The campaign after Kennedy's and Richard Nixon's nomination was bitter and vigorously fought. But Kennedy's wit, charm, knowledge of the issues, and his great style won the day. He slipped into the presidency by approximately 1 vote per precinct nationwide. In Huntington the Saturday before this fateful election, Robert Kennedy touched down at the airport for a short press conference with a scattering of newsmen and interested supporters. Afterwards, while waiting for his staff to reboard the plane, he and I chatted briefly. "We love West Virginia and what it has done for us," he commented. "If we win on Tuesday, and right now we're not sure, we won't forget you." A prophetic statement. West Virginia was never so loved as it was in the next 3 years. Every part of America had prospered, including West Virginia, as it emerged from World War II, while reshaping its economy from a wartime to a peacetime base, and assisting war-ravaged Europe and the Western Pacific islands to recover. The mills, mines, and other sectors of industrial America hummed with activity. In time, this prosperity renewal ran its course, and part of the country began to feel the effects of the decline. It was then that Kennedy traveled to West Virginia in search of votes, where at the end of World War II, more than 115,000 miners were needed to mine coal. Mechanization had reduced the workforce to 43,000, a lessening of manpower requirements which had spun off into other parts of the economy. Approximately 1/10 of the population was destitute during the time Kennedy and Humphrey were here. Kennedy could hardly believe what he found traveling from town to town. "Imagine," he said to one of his assistants, "just imagine kids who never drink milk." As his first official act as president, Kennedy issued an executive order doubling and improving surplus commodity allotments for welfare families of this and other states. A short time later, he appointed a special task force in West Virginia to determine its most critical needs. Out of this group's discussions, as well as other recommendations, here are some of the more notable occurrences during the Kennedy years in the White House. The food stamp program was implemented. The Naval Ordnance Plant in South Charleston was sold to FMC Corporation, which meant 1,800 new jobs. New factories were attracted to West Virginia. The Tariff Commission made changes in regulations which gave relief to West Virginia's flat-glass industry. Funding was authorized for 4 new state parks, among them Canaan Valley and Pipestem Resorts. Grant money was approved for the building of Interstate 79 between Charleston and Pittsburgh. Illustrative of Kennedy's commitment to West Virginia were these facts. Where this state was in deep trouble economically in 1950, in 3 years, unemployment fell from 105,000 to 44,000. Migration out of the state was arrested. Manufacturing payrolls grew by 11,000, and manufacturing investment increased by $146 million. The elevation of Lyndon Johnson from vice president to president after the Kennedy assassination did not change the momentum of federal funding to the states, very much to the contrary. Among the earliest of Kennedy's programs he pushed through Congress after taking office was the Appalachian Regional Commission legislation, which over the years has permitted the building of many miles of corridor roads, the construction of scores of water and sewage systems, and the enrichment of public health facilities, Johnson was also responsible for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and under his Great Society banner, an expanded anti-poverty program, mass transit aid, Medicaid for the poor, aid to elementary and secondary schools, college loans and scholarships, expanded housing for low-income families, and for cultural lovers, a national foundation for the arts and humanities. While President Johnson did not accord West Virginia the special status his predecessor did, his national commitment, which reached into countless corners of America, made things better for this state. The question is often asked, what would have happened as regards the Vietnam War if Kennedy had lived? It must be remembered that he had the war-experienced serviceman's respect for human life. He also had been embarrassed worldwide by the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba his first year in office. As a consequence of the escalation of the war, many thousands of civilian and military personnel were killed. A country was devastated. It cost America more than $200 billion, and as a result of President Johnson's decision to finance a war and his Great Society program at the same time, the United States was plunged into indebtedness so massive it still is trying to find ways to regain the fiscal respectability once accorded it by the rest of the world, I think.
Thank you, Tom. On the film a short time ago, you saw Ken Kurtz as he looked 100 pounds and 30 years ago when he was the closest thing to perpetual motion we boasted in West Virginia. Ken, at that time, at the time of the 1960 campaign, was with WSAZ TV. He had just joined that station earlier that year. After 6 years with SAZ, he left the state and worked in Indiana, North Carolina, and Kentucky, and he retired last fall after 14 years as news director of the CBS affiliate TV station in Lexington, Kentucky. And he also wanted me to mention that he be sure to mention he's a native of Weston. Ken?
Let me tell you, it was very heady stuff for a young reporter just turned 30 to be back in his home state just in time for the great event, working for one of the finest local TV news operations in America, a station which utterly dominated this part of West Virginia, getting to call Mr. Brinkley David and getting to know some of the top names in American journalism then. And when NBC News decided that this truly was a key primary, they asked WSAZ for permission to set up a temporary news operation in Charleston in my newsroom. My cup runneth over. David Brinkley fed pieces to New York from our studios. Herb Kaplow became the resident correspondent. Executives descended on us from Washington and New York, making Charleston and 310 Dickinson Street the temporary headquarters of NBC News, which nationally was then totally dominant with its Huntley Brinkley report. Well, for years I've taught my news staffs that a good rule for journalists is never assume. Some of those well-known major media reporters who came to cover the primary made the mistake of violating this rule. They assumed we were ignorant hillbillies and prejudiced Protestants. I don't think we were. West Virginia voted for Al Smith in the primary of 1928. That he lost to Republican Herbert Hoover in the general election cannot be laid at the doorstep of religious prejudice. West Virginia then was a Republican state, and Smith's wet stance hurt him more than his religion. So now comes a second Catholic, 32 years later, and a lot of political writers descended on West Virginia, as Harry Ernst wrote, and we're finding bigots behind every bush. Most journalists overlook the political forces at work and overemphasize the Protestant heritage of West Virginians. 2 out of every 3 citizens were not affiliated with any church. Pollster Samuel Lubell suggested the religious issue was being exaggerated during the primary and said he found considerable evidence to indicate there was less bigotry in West Virginia than in most other states. A former staffer of mine told me of an incident she observed in Cabin Creek. While Kennedy was campaigning, a reporter from a certain national news magazine, whose name will not be mentioned at this time, was questioning a male hillbilly type nearby. The interview went something like this: "Do you have any problem voting for a Catholic?" "I vote Democratic." "Does Mr. Kennedy's being a Catholic bother you?" I vote straight Democratic, son. Well, does it disturb you that a Catholic is running for president? Do you have any ill feelings toward Catholics? Nope, never met one. JFK fought religious prejudice by his frequent speeches and news conference quotes about his constitutional oath, his support for separation of church and state, his frequent running on TV of kinescope of his meeting with Protestant ministers. It ran over and over and over, all time paid for by JFK. But I'd like to concentrate my remarks on a media event which has, in my opinion, been overlooked. An event, in my judgment, almost as important in the history of the American media as the West Virginia primary was in American politics. But to set the stage, go back to television news coverage of primaries before 1960. It's easy. There wasn't much of it. Don't think of the massive TV coverage of campaigns and elections of today. That type of coverage simply did not exist in 1960, and it changed because, in part, of West Virginia. A top NBC News executive calls West Virginia 1960 the first TV-impacted primary. Before 1960, good professional TV news operations like NBC and like WSAZ relied heavily on the wire services, especially AP. AP was comprehensive, conservative, reliable, and slow. We knew AP would tabulate election night because they had always done so, and while slow, they were seldom wrong. AP did so by having stringers, reporters hired just for election night in as many county courthouses as possible. They phoned the results to state headquarters and they were tabulated there in a cumulative method. That is, from County A at 8 p.m., the stringer calls in 450 votes for Kennedy. At 8:15, he calls in and says Kennedy now has 600 votes. And he's reading those figures from the county election clerk's running total. AP, having already put out Kennedy with 450 votes in that county, has to subtract 450 votes from 600 to add 150 new votes to keep its running total statewide accurate. Accurate, but slow. And AP is counting all the votes from many races, not just the presidential primary, but governor and auditor and commissioner of agriculture, because its member newspapers and broadcast stations demand that and are paying for it. So good local news operations, like WSAZ, with their own well-developed year-round stringer systems, get the jump on our television competition by playing AP's game. That is, we had our stringers call in the early results from their home counties, perhaps a dozen of them. We also exchanged returns with WTRF-TV in Wheeling and other stations. We try to beat AP. We hook the viewers by higher early totals, and then as surely as God made little green apples, as AP's mighty county stringer network overtakes us, we switch totals from our own to AP's. Well, CBS had been doing very well with an expanded but similar system, and the NBC News president, William McAndrew, asked his Washington News Bureau chief, a man with previous experience setting up the CBS election system, if he could now beat CBS. Elmer Lauer, in turn, got his assistant, Bert Ivry, to come up with some figures. Bert figured, and Elmer took his guess that $15,000 would allow NBC to set up an improved election night system in West Virginia to McAndrew. McAndrew, in turn, went to the president of NBC, Bob Kintner, and got approval. 15 G's is petty cash at NBC these days, but in 1960 it took an okay from the top man. But Lauer got it. And Lauer came to Charleston, first meeting with Nick Basso, then news director, soon to be succeeded by Boz Johnson, and worked out a merger of the WSAZ stringer system plus some new wrinkles of NBC's own, and based everything out of my newsroom in Charleston. Bert Ivry came down from New York and spent 3 weeks setting up the new system. Here was the old part. Stringers in every county courthouse where the election results were counted, the AP system, using the WSAZ stringers as a nucleus. With NBC's money and Bert's time, he found stringers in all 55 counties, plus some extra ones for populous areas where we might gather relatively large early results to get the jump on CBS and AP. Here was the new part. The stringers did not call in the cumulative or running totals. They called in each precinct by precinct as they came in. And through the use of an ingenious NCR tabulating machine, which Bert found, which the Charleston National Cash Register staff set up in our studios and manned that night, we were able to add in Charleston, no matter how fast the 60-some stringers called in results from West Virginia's 3,000 precincts. Wrinkle 2, we single-shotted it. While AP tabulated it all, even though they moved more frequent results on the Kennedy-Humphrey race, we covered almost nothing but the Kennedy-Humphrey race. We specialized and we ran ahead. I have watched AP election returns on many nights. In West Virginia, the NBC WSAC system ran 50% ahead of AP. Nothing like it had ever happened before. Never had one news gathering organization like this beaten a wire service in a statewide race and beaten it decisively. Bill Lawrence of the New York Times was in our studio that night. He was, in my opinion, the finest political reporter of his time. He compared our returns with AP's, and when he wrote his story as the New York Times front page the next day, he quoted the NBC WSAZ returns as signaling the Kennedy victory, early enough in the evening to make the Times early editions, and early enough to recall JFK back from Washington. It sounds so simple now. It was revolutionary then. An NBC News memo of 1963 called their 1962 off-year coverage as, quote, an extension and refinement of our 1960 presidential election coverage. The latter, in turn, was a national refinement of our experimental coverage in West Virginia primary on May 10, 1960. The promise of the new system was not lost on NBC News executives. It was expanded, refined, and became the basis for many years of the top-rated election night reporting of Chet and Dave. The NBC News election night instruction sheet to county reporters for the 60 general election carried the notation, derived from the West Virginia experience. It may sound like so little, but the experiment in West Virginia spread, each network adding refinements. In 4 years, financial pressures and a debacle in reporting California results produced NES. You may know it now as the News Election Service, but it started life as the Network Election Service. And it is not far-fetched to say the revolution in TV coverage of election night returns got its start the night of May 10th, 1960 in West Virginia. TV is a medium that devours things, time and places and events and people. This is my attempt to say to all of you, stop now and pay attention to Elmer Lauer, the architect, and Bert Ivry, the able technician, who deserve more than a footnote in TV's news history, if it's ever written. Did Kennedy buy the West Virginia primary? I don't think so, at least not in the sense most writers mean, the illegal use of money buying votes. But before telling you why not, let me journalistically cite some evidence the other way. There was then, and may still be now, the half-pint vote. The Gazette and the Daily Mail used to report figures on how many half-pint whiskey bottles were stocked in state stores just before every election. The inference being those popular small sizes were used to buy votes. I hope those papers still report this, for I doubt if the practice, which is much older than 1960, has died out. And on election night, live from the WSAZ studios, NBC pollster Stan Lubell says to Senator Kennedy, I have a lot of reports from Charleston's black wards. We expected them to go for Senator Humphrey because of his civil rights record, but they're going overwhelmingly for you. How do you explain that, Senator Kennedy? Lubell pushes a sheaf of papers across the news desk. Kennedy, cool as always, studies the papers briefly, pushes them back. I don't know, Mr. Lubell. How do you explain that? Even more telling is this story I had from a reliable source. Bob Berry, Humphrey's state campaign manager, shortly before the primary day, rushes into the Canal Hotel, goes up to the mezzanine, bursts into Kennedy headquarters, confronts Pierre Salinger behind the desk. You son of a bitch, Berry explodes. We bought Logan County, and you bought it back. Yes, says the smiling Salinger, and that ain't all. Despite all of this, I do not believe Kennedy bought the West Virginia primary in the sense I have stated. He won because he had overwhelming resources. These money did buy. Because he had a much better set-up organization, because he had a magical name campaigning for him, FDR Jr., because he had a charismatic campaigner, himself and family, because he had more money for advertising and campaigning, all legal, because he projected the persona of a winner, because he took his fight to the people who responded, because he met issues head-on, his religion and others, and for these and other reasons he probably deserved to win, and he did. Yet Kennedy was by no means sure that he would win. Like many campaigns, his had highs and lows. Near the end, a poll in Huntington said Kennedy would lose. So not at all sure of his victory, he spent election night in Washington. To me, that is a strong signal he did not know the outcome. He sent word to the media that he would not come to West Virginia unless he won. When that word came from the NBC WSAZ figures, Kennedy grabbed his charter plane and set sail for Charleston. Elmer Lauer got word of this from NBC News Washington and sent an assistant to the airport to bring Kennedy to our studios. Let me tell you now, for what I think is the first time, what happened. The plane landed, Kennedy, Matt Reese, and others piled into the car with the NBC staffer. Kennedy did not know who the staffer was. He assumed he was among members of his own campaign staff. His reaction to all in that car was shock, bordering on disbelief. He was bowled over. He kept saying, and these are direct quotes, "I can't believe we did it. How do you think we did it? I was sure we'd lose." And that is why polls will never replace elections.
Thank you, Ken. At the time of the 1960 primary, Bob Miller was news director of WWNR Radio in Beckley. He was also the first president of the Associated Press News Directors Association in West Virginia. He is now in state government as Assistant State Labor Commissioner. Bob?
Well, it's really fun to be here today. I don't have a prepared thing because it was fun to see Ken Kurtz again. I haven't seen Ken for 25 years. Ken was the ultimate news reporter. If it happened anywhere in West Virginia, it was Ken Kurtz always out there. Other than losing a little hair on top, he's about the same as he was 25 years ago. Truly a magnificent television reporter that contributed a lot to Channel 3 and to news coverage in West Virginia. My view on the Kennedy thing is not the view that you've received so far, because when Herb Little wrote a piece of copy, that copy went statewide because Herb worked for the Associated Press. And all those AP newspapers out there, newspaper broadcasters got it. And when Tommy Stafford wrote for the Gazette, even though everybody doesn't read the Gazette, Tommy thought they did, so he went ahead and distributed his copy. And when Ken Kurtz did it, it could be on Channel 3 or on NBC. Well, I was a young guy that had come out of the Army, and I didn't have a vocation, and I didn't have very much education. Therefore, I was eminently qualified to be a news reporter. So I took a job at WWNR in Beckley, which was the Ray Hall family station in Beckley at that time. As a matter of fact, Nick Joe, our congressman, was a high school kid. Nick used to come to the station sometimes and fill in for the announcers. He had a terrible radio voice, but he was a nice kid. So I've kidded Nick over the years about, well, Nick, you just didn't have the ability to make it in broadcasting, so you had to settle for politics. But when the Kennedy campaign came to Beckley, I covered it. There were two stations there. There was NR, and there was WJLS, and of course Governor Smith is here, and my former boss, I worked in Governor Smith's office. WJLS was W. Joel Smith, and we were NR, which was Nick Ray Hall. So out of deference to the governor being here, they had half the audience, and we had the other half. Although the polls show we had a little bit more than that. So I interviewed Jack Kennedy when he came to town. I covered his press conferences, his speeches, his rallies. I interviewed Bobby when he came to town. As a matter of fact, Bobby was in and out of our station a lot. I think he kind of liked it. He used it as a headquarters. I interviewed Franklin Roosevelt Jr. when he came to town. My middle name is Franklin. I was born in 35. The old man was going to name me Franklin Delano Roosevelt Miller. I told FDR Jr. that story. He said, hey, I meet a lot of FDRs around the country. But FDR Jr. was important to the Kennedy campaign. They put him down south. There's that famous picture of Dr. Ward Wiley in Wyoming County, riding in that convertible with Jack Kennedy and FDR. The Kennedy campaign, it's interesting, some of the observations here. Did he buy it? No, he didn't buy West Virginia. They put together a campaign that they knew could make it in West Virginia. The first time I met Jack Kennedy, I'll never forget it. You know, like the day he was shot in Dallas. Will any of us ever forget what we were doing at that moment? I'll never forget the day that I met him. I tried to reach him earlier in the day in Huntington because he was coming to Beckley for a rally and a press conference. And I couldn't get a hold of him, so about 1 minute before 6 o'clock, Senator Kennedy called, and he said, I understand you've been trying to get hold of me. And I said, yeah. I said, I wanted an interview, but I can't because I'm getting ready to go on the air. He said, well, why don't you put me on live? And I said, why not? So I put him on live, and we talked for about 5 minutes. He came to town later that evening, and as a news reporter, I was objective. I covered Hubert Humphrey things when Hubert came to Beckley. I covered Ed Muskie when he came to Beckley. I covered Eleanor Roosevelt when she came to Beckley. I covered Bobby when he came to Beckley. But when Jack Kennedy walked into Raleigh County Courthouse for that press conference, the room lit up. He was unique. Jack Kennedy won the primary in West Virginia because he was Jack Kennedy. And when people met him, I think they connected with that very closely. So that is a personal view toward my feeling toward Jack Kennedy, and also a view from a newsman at that time, because I covered the news and I covered Hubert a lot too. But I don't think there are any West Virginians out there that didn't get a chance to meet him or talk to him that didn't connect with him. I think he had that kind of a personality. He came to West Virginia and everybody talked about the religious issue. You know, I don't know what the religious issue was. Was it manufactured by the press? Was it real? Even 30 years later, I don't know. But I'm inclined to think that Kennedy took the religious issue and brought it out front. He talked about it. You know, a lot of politicians don't want to talk about the negatives. They want to talk about the positives. Kennedy talked about the religious thing as a perceived negative at that time. I'm not quite certain in my mind that the religious issue wasn't a positive for Jack Kennedy, because if you wanted to prove that you didn't hold religious bias and prejudices, you could prove that by voting for Jack Kennedy. So I don't know how this religion thing cuts. Everything that you read about it is always prominent. It's prominent in the books and the reviews and the newspaper stories and all the stuff that went on. But it was an exciting period of time for West Virginia. It was an exciting period of time for a young news reporter at a 1,000-watt radio station out on the hinterlands that had the chance to talk to these people and meet them. And we all hold our memories of special things, and quite frankly, I hold a very special memory of Jack Kennedy in West Virginia in 1960. Thank you.
We are running a little behind, so we won't take questions now, but we'll have a break till 2:45, and if you have any questions, you can ask them at the panelists during the break.